In this lecture, I will be going over the meninges and circulation of the brain. At the end of this lecture, you will be able to describe and identify the 3 layers of meninges. Describe the location of the meningeal infoldings and discuss the role they play in subdividing the brain. Identify the major arteries supplying blood to the brain and describe the pattern and importance of the circle of Willis. And lastly, identify the dural venous sinuses and describe the pathway of venous drainage of the brain. The meninges surround and protect the central nervous system. The cranial meninges are going to surround and protect the brain. There are 3 different meningeal layers: the outermost layer, the dura mater, an intermediate layer, the arachnoid mater, and an innermost layer, the pia mater. The dura mater is the strongest and toughest of the 3 layers, and it's the most external of the 3. It's going to be positioned right on the inner aspect of the skull. It's also going to have infoldings, known as meningeal infoldings, which are extensions of the dural tissue down into the fissures of our brain. An example of this is the falx cerebri. The meninges are also going to create small cavities known as dural venous sinuses, like the superior sagittal sinus, which we see here coursing along the superior edge of the falx cerebri. These sinuses drain the venous blood of the brain. The arachnoid mater is held up tight on the inner surface of the dura mater due to the pressure of cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, which is located within the subarachnoid space. The subarachnoid space is going to extend all the way down to the pia mater, so CSF will be located between the arachnoid and pia layers. The arachnoid mater got its name due to the delicate spiderweb-like appearance of the fibers that will extend from the superficial surface down deep towards the pia mater. The pia mater covers the surface of the brain and contains tiny blood vessels that will carry the blood that will be filtered through the blood-brain barrier to provide the nutrients to the brain tissue itself. The meninges are going to receive their arterial blood supply predominantly through the middle meningeal artery, seen here sandwiched between the dura mater and the inner aspect of the skull. The middle meningeal artery arose from the maxillary artery and came up through the small foramen spinosum located here in the middle cranial fossa. The dural infoldings, otherwise known as meningeal infoldings, are going to be positioned between the large gaps within our brain known as fissures. We are going to see a dural infolding between the right and left cerebral hemispheres, known as the falx cerebri. Falx actually means sickle, so this is a sickle-shaped large extension of dural tissue, extending from the anterior aspect of our anterior cranial fossa, where it attaches at the crista galli, a ridge-like projection from the ethmoid bone. It's then going to attach to the inner aspect of the frontal bone, continue along posteriorly towards the parietal bones until it reaches the occipital bone posteriorly. In line with the falx cerebri, but positioned more inferior to it, we see the separation between the cerebellar hemispheres created by the falx cerebelli. Where the falx cerebelli meets up with the falx cerebri, we see another horizontally aligned dural extension, known as the tentorium cerebelli. The tentorium cerebelli is going to be positioned between the cerebellum inferiorly and the occipital lobe of our cerebrum superiorly. The gap within the tentorium cerebelli is known as the tentorial notch, which is going to allow for passage of the brainstem up through from the posterior cranial fossa towards the middle cranial fossa. Now, the meningeal infoldings are actually going to be created by extensions of dural tissue. And how this looks if we were to take a cross-sectional cut down through the skull. What we would see is that the cranium itself, or the skull, is going to be lined on its inner aspect by the dura mater. Now, the dura mater itself is going to line the inner aspect, and then it's going to have two layers that will separate at these points. An outermost periosteal layer that stays in contact with the skull, and an inner layer known as the meningeal layer that is going to extend on either side down into those fissures, and then create little pockets known as dural venous sinuses. These dural venous sinuses are where we're going to get the drainage of the venous blood from our brain. But the actual infolding itself is created by this infolding from the meningeal layer of the dura, and that's what we're seeing represented here in the 3D model by these structures. The human brain is not particularly huge when we compare it to the size of our overall body. It is very large compared to other species, but in regard to the rest of our body, it's maybe only 2 or 3% of the total mass. However, it's going to be requiring almost a sixth of the total cardiac output, or the blood coming out of our heart, and it can use up to 1/5 of the total oxygen content within that blood. So this is a highly metabolic organ. In order to provide the brain with all of that blood that it requires, there are two dominant routes to bring blood to the brain. The internal carotid artery, located more anteriorly, and the vertebral artery, located more posteriorly. Let's first take a look at the path of the internal carotid artery to enter the skull. If I were to fade the different bones here surrounding this region, we can see that the internal carotid artery actually turns medially within the bone. At the base of the skull, the internal carotid artery enters a space known as the carotid canal. This is going to be located within the temporal bone. At this point, it's going to course medially and horizontally, and then ascend up into the skull just superior to the foramen lacerum. At this point, the internal carotid artery is going to take a curve within the skull itself, and this will be within a space known as the cavernous sinus. So the internal carotid artery still has not branched as it's coming up through this space, and then it curves back on itself, where it is now going to join with the circle of Willis, the arterial cerebral circle that is going to supply blood to the brain tissue. The alternate route into the brain is going to be for the vertebral artery. Now, the vertebral artery bilaterally ascended up through the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebrae. Those are also going to curve medially just at the base of the skull, where they then ascend up through the largest opening in the skull, the foramen magnum. Once the vertebral arteries have entered the skull within the posterior cranial fossa, they're going to join together to form the basilar artery. So the right vertebral artery and the left vertebral artery join to make the basilar artery. Clinically, it's important to understand which aspects of the brain get blood supply from which vessel. The vertebral artery is going to supply the cerebellum, the brainstem, and the occipital lobe of the cerebrum, while the internal carotid artery is going to supply the temporal lobes, the frontal lobes, and the parietal lobes along the midline. So remember that the two dominant blood vessels that bring blood to the brain are the internal carotid artery and the vertebral artery. The circle of Willis, or cerebral arterial circle, is a loop of arteries at the base of the brain. This loop is going to allow for redundant blood supply, or a backup route known as collateral circulation. And the theory behind this is that if one vessel becomes blocked, there would be an alternative route around the circle to reach the area that would have been supplied by that vessel directly. So theoretically, with slow occlusion of one of the vessels, the circle of Willis would provide an alternative way for the blood to still reach all aspects of the brain. Now, let's say there was a stroke or something that happened really quick, or an aneurysm, and blood loss would then result to a certain area of the brain. Now, we wouldn't automatically have the blood compensated for with that lost vessel, but in slow filling or occlusions of the vessels with atherosclerosis, it could be possible to provide a backup blood supply to all aspects of the brain through this arterial circle. Now, the major contributions to the circle are going to be provided by the two major inflows of blood to the brain. The anterior route of blood to reach the brain is the internal carotid artery on both the right and the left sides. So we're going to have on the left side of the skull an internal carotid artery ascending up to this loop, and on the right side of the individual's skull. Now, the internal carotid artery is a major blood vessel that is going to supply the anterior and lateral aspects of our brain. And the major vessels branching off of this that I want to highlight are the middle cerebral artery and the anterior cerebral artery. So the internal carotid artery is essentially going to split into a branch that goes laterally out towards the parietal and temporal lobes, and an anterior branch that's going to go towards the frontal lobes. The right and left sides are going to be connected by a small vessel known as the anterior communicating artery. And this is really what's going to connect the right and left sides' blood supply anteriorly within our brain. The other route for blood to come into the brain is through the vertebral arteries, again paired right and left. These two vessels are going to ascend up through foramen magnum with the spinal cord, and then they merge together to form a vessel known as the basilar artery. Now we can see that there are multiple branches coming to the cerebellum and brainstem off of the basilar artery, as well as the vertebral arteries. However, I'm not concerned with memorizing those at this time. The basilar artery is going to be the midline unpaired vessel formed by the junction of the right and left vertebral arteries, and it's going to terminate as the posterior cerebral artery. So we've now seen that there was an anterior cerebral, a middle cerebral, and now a posterior cerebral. And this is going to go back towards the occipital lobe. Now, the communication between the anterior blood supply from the internal carotid artery and the posterior blood supply from the vertebral arteries is through the small posterior communicating artery. So we can see that the posterior cerebral artery will now be connected to the internal carotid artery near the junction or splitting point of the middle and anterior cerebral arteries. So the posterior communicating and anterior communicating arteries are the key vessels to make this loop function. The dural venous sinuses are endothelial-lined spaces formed between the meningeal and periosteal layers of the dura. Recall that the meningeal infoldings or dural infoldings, like the falx cerebri, are going to be extensions of the meningeal layer. So as the meningeal layer extends down and away from the periosteal layer, it's going to create these infoldings as well as these spaces that are going to contain the dural venous sinuses. Now, it's not necessary at this point to go through all of the different names of the sinuses, but I want to highlight a few of them that are the dominant route of blood drainage from the brain. So the veins from our brain are going to drain into these spaces. From the cerebrum, predominantly that's going to go through the superior sagittal sinus, along the superior aspect of the falx cerebri, and the inferior sagittal sinus along the inferior aspect of the falx cerebri. These two spaces, the superior and inferior sagittal sinuses, are named due to their anatomical orientation within the sagittal plane. So in the mid-sagittal plane, we're going to find the most superior of the sinuses, and then just below it, following the same curvature, the inferior sagittal sinus. At the posterior aspect of our brain, we're going to see all of these sinuses start to funnel together towards the same point, which is known as the confluence of sinuses, and this is located anterior to the occipital bone. The confluence is going to collect the venous blood returning from the brain and send it back down and out through the skull. And how this is going to happen is through a bilaterally located transverse sinus. So we have a transverse sinus going to the right and a transverse sinus going to the left. These transverse sinuses are going to meet up with the S-shaped sigmoid sinus, which is going to go from the lateral aspect of our skull back near the lateral portion of the petrous ridge from our temporal bone and descend down inferiorly towards the jugular foramen. At the jugular foramen is going to be the beginning point or the superior extent of the internal jugular vein. So what we're going to see is the formation of the internal jugular vein is now going to correlate to the venous drainage from all of the different dural venous sinuses within our skull.